retail recruitment, state of downtown report, tracking data on economic development, real estate activity, market trends, and serving as a liaison to the city on issues affecting downtown's planning and business community, such as parks, bicycle planning, parking, litter, and business recruitment. Obviously, a very busy job, and he has done a terrific job with it, making it very data-based. He recruits new retail and storefront businesses to downtown, has certainly helped us along as we've done downtown projects, pulling in retailers and just building the emphasis on downtown, and is the author of the annual State of Downtown report, which includes quarterly economic development reports and tracks business and development activity, market trends, projections, data, tax revenue, etc. So if you'll join me in welcoming Bill to the stage.
All right, well, thank you so much, and TJ, thank you for all your work on this day. We're really excited about it. This first session is really meant to form a baseline. It's meant to give us a sense of what are we even talking about? What do we mean by affordable housing? What do we mean by cost burden housing or missing middle? And what's going on in this region? What's happening in the Triangle? Where are gaps? What are the trends we're seeing specifically in this regional housing market? So we feel like this will give a baseline for the rest of the day's discussion. So then you'll have a sense of what's happening and how to talk. So it's going to give us a common language in which to talk about housing in this region. I'm really excited about my speakers today. We've got a couple of experts in the region. I'm going to introduce my second speaker first. John Hodges-Koppel is a regional planning director with the Triangle J Council of Governments. It's a great organization. It's a regional planning body. They're doing some of the best research on our housing issues that there are. They've done an enormous amount of work on that intersection between land use and transportation infrastructure. They spend a lot of time getting all of our regional governments and municipalities to work together on that. John is filling in for us. Aspen Romaine, who works for Triangle J Council of Governments, is a real expert in housing. She couldn't be here today due to sickness, so John is going to take over and walk us through her data, but she is an absolute expert, and if you need information on our regional housing market, she's someone you should definitely reach out to. John did his undergrad at a football school in Durham, and then he went to the finest city and regional planning program in the country at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. That's right. Oh, very good. Look at that. Wow, a clap for Chapel Hill. This is wild. So we're really excited to have him. Our first speaker, though, is Kyle Vangel. He's with HR&A Associates. Kyle has done a lot of great work here in Raleigh over the last few years. He's part of the downtown plan team. Also worked on the downtown disposition study. He's been heavily involved in Dix Park. And he's also worked around the country. He's worked in Boston on issues around affordability and housing, and is a national expert on this. But he has a lot of great data here in Wake County, and we're really excited to have him on our panel as well. So thank you all so much. We're going to have a couple of speakers, and then we'll take questions at the end. But we hope you get a lot out of this. So Kyle, come on up and take it away.
Great. So I'm just going to really focus on some national trends that we're seeing as a firm that's working nationally on affordable housing policy, and also delve into how those relate to the local market. So I hope that that will be interesting and build a good bridge to John and the data that he'll be presenting. So as Bill mentioned, HR&A is a real estate and economic development consulting firm. We often work at the intersection of the public and the private sectors. I started our office here in Raleigh in 2016. In terms of our affordable housing practice, we're really working at a range of scales, ranging from the overall housing strategy, like the one that we created for Wake County a couple years ago, down to the transaction level, helping developers sort of navigate financial feasibility at a project basis. And I think that gives us kind of a good perspective on both overall policy solutions as well as the economics of what we're seeing out there. So as Bill mentioned, I'm just going to start with kind of a definitional tour of some of the definitions that you'll see in my presentation and subsequent presentations throughout the day. First, just some affordability key terms. So let's dive in. So area median income, AMI, is an important definition, and it's basically exactly what it sounds like. You sort of array the income distribution of the area. In this case, we're showing the Raleigh MSA. And the median is the midpoint, and it is calculated differently based on the household size. But AMI is important because it's used to determine eligibility for subsidized income-restricted housing for a variety of federal programs. You can see here the Raleigh MSA's median is $84,300. That's the 100% AMI level. But we're going to be talking a lot about different bands below that, 30%, 50%, 80%, and what those definitions tend to mean in real terms. In terms of how households in the Raleigh MSA break down, now we're looking at the full spectrum all the way up to 120% of AMI. That encapsulates 70% of all households in the region. You see that there's a particular concentration, over 130,000 households in the region are below 50% of AMI, and these are the people most in need of affordable housing. And affordable housing itself as a term can have different definitions and meanings. And how that's applied can vary depending on the different AMI levels that we're talking about. So for instance, one thing you'll often hear about is public housing, which is truly owned and operated by the public sector or housing authorities. This is really housing that's affordable at the very lowest end of the spectrum in terms of 0 to 30% of AMI, people that are extremely in need of affordable housing. When we talk about affordable housing sort of writ large, what we often are talking about is people between 0 and 60% of the spectrum that have a variety of different housing solutions that can be available. And lastly, a term that's gained increasing sort of use and frequency in recent years is workforce housing, which, as we'll be discussing in the affordability crisis getting worse throughout the country, this workforce housing, which would include moderate and middle income households, has become an increasing need in recent years and is requiring new policy solutions than what might be applicable to public housing or other types of affordable housing. Cost burden is a definition that I'll reference from time to time. And basically what cost burden means, and it can be for renters or for owners of housing, is if you are spending more than 30% of your gross pre-tax income on housing, you are considered cost burdened by federal definition standards. If you are spending more than 50% of your income, you are considered severely cost burdened. Households spending this much money don't have as much available to pay for all of the other necessities of life. So that's going to be a key definition that we'll look at, and we'll look at some trends and how that's evolved over time. Beyond just these income limits and sort of the financial criteria, there's also obviously a physical dimension to housing. And a lot of the presentations that we'll be talking about today are going to get into the types of solutions that might be sort of filling in what the market isn't providing as much of in this region. This can help better match housing solutions with the preferences and the income levels of people that need housing. So obviously, we see a lot of single-family development in this region. It tends to not be happening as close to the urban core as it once did. On the other end of the spectrum, we see a lot of sort of mid-rise apartment development. But increasingly, there's the notion of a missing middle. Those housing solutions, some of them do happen and are frequent, like townhomes, but there are a lot of other things that could be happening. These include bungalow courts, duplexes, triplexes that are not being supplied as readily by the market, but could be interesting solutions if the right regulatory mechanisms are in place to allow them. So let's talk about then, sort of what we're seeing in terms of measuring affordability challenges and how that's evolving over time, both nationally and in the triangle. Then we'll get into what is the root cause of some of those trends. So homeownership rates have fallen from historic highs before the Great Recession. They're now reaching almost historic lows. So we've always been, as a country in recent decades, within sort of 60 to 70%. Right now, we're closer to 60% at the sort of the lowest level we've seen in recent decades. One thing that the decline in home ownership has meant, the country's population is still going up, is that there are more renters. And for the nation's renter households, housing affordability is getting worse. The share of renter households with a cost burden, which remember means they're paying at least 30% of their income towards housing, has increased from 38% in 2000 to 46% in 2016. That is an increase of 6.6 million households nationwide that are who are renters and are cost burdened. This is a problem that's also being felt acutely throughout the country. I think, historically, a lot of folks might have thought of housing affordability as a challenge that was mostly a coastal challenge. It was mostly a challenge of cities with extremely high land prices and extremely constrained development opportunities. That's no longer the case. This is showing the share of renter households with a cost burden in 2017. The darker, the more orange and red the shading is, the more of the larger share of households are cost burden. You see a large portion of the United States is filled in at this point, sort of extending throughout the country in terms of where that cost burden is. It's also shifted the composition of who comprises this cost burden. Now, certainly, a high percentage of low-income renters, which we're defining as up to $35,000, are cost burdened. Now, fully 74% of them, 3/4, are cost burdened, up slightly from 2000. High-income households are also experiencing slightly more cost burden, although the vast majority are not cost burdened at 6%. The real growth we've seen in the past 16 years is in middle-income households, what we might define as 35 to 75,000 in household income. That's grown from 19% to 33%, 32% in recent years, really showing how this is becoming a problem throughout the spectrum of income. In terms of what's causing this, we're really seeing two fundamental trends. Real renter incomes are stagnant or falling, while rents are rising. So I'll try to explain the graph a little better here. The orange line is showing the median rent that is affordable to you to the median household based on their income. In 2000, that was $986 a month. Incomes fell in real terms. They've risen more recently, but they're still sort of not where they were in 2000. So the median household today can really afford to pay $932. But since 2000, real rents have gone up steadily. They've gone up from $839 a month to $981 a month. And now they are, in fact, higher than what the median household can afford to pay based on their income. In Wake County, we're seeing similar trends play out. So this is showing two things. It's showing the blue line, the cost of rental housing, and this is indexed to 2000. The orange line is the median household income. And we see that for sort of 2000 to 2010, there was, median household income was basically always higher than the cost of rental housing. But coming out of the recession in this market, in a lot of the markets we work in around the country, something changed. And housing costs have increased significantly, all told over the 16 years. The cost of housing is up 42%, but median household incomes are only up 26%. Now, we're focused on housing here. We're going to sort of delve into some of the drivers of the affordability challenge. So not going to focus as much on the fact that incomes are stagnant, but really want to talk about the other side of the coin. Why is housing getting more expensive? So we're really seeing three things contributing to this. One, development costs are rising. Two, the amount of public funding that's available in order to provide or preserve affordable housing is decreasing, which means there's less supply. And then finally, when you have this supply-demand mismatch, it's not just of subsidized housing that might be provided by the public sector, but we're also seeing a decline in what we'll call naturally affordable housing, which I'll sort of explain more in a moment. But really, these three trends are playing out. So first, on rising development costs. So this is national data. It's showing the real costs of residential construction in the United States from 2000 to 2016. Those real hard costs of construction went up 57%, pretty steadily over that period. In terms of land costs, there was a bit more of an up and down with the recession, and certainly land costs have risen far more in some more urban markets than on a national average basis. But those are also up 15% over the whole period in real terms. Now, what this means in terms of development feasibility is fundamentally, your hard costs and soft costs of development are going up in real terms. This means that you are needing more financing, whether it's debt or equity, in order to effectively move forward with a development. And in order for that development to pencil and be financially feasible, developers need to charge more rent. And really that's a contributor towards the housing crisis that we're seeing. The second thing, declining public funding. So this graph is showing 2004 to 2016, both capital funds, which are traditionally applied to housing authorities, home funds provided to local governments, both of which have been steadily declining over this period. So the amount of subsidy that's available for subsidized housing has declined. At the same time, as I mentioned, the number of renters is going up significantly nationwide. So 33% more rental households from 2000 to 2017. So the demand has only increased. It's not going anywhere. At the same time, we have a lot of sort of existing housing units that are subsidized via LIHTC, via other instruments. Their affordability periods are expiring. And this is a nationwide problem. We're seeing that by 2027, over 1 million housing units could be lost to expiring subsidies. Here in Wake County, there are 9,000 publicly assisted units that could lose their affordability restriction in the next 20 years, which is a problem that many people in this room are working against. But there's also the question of what's called NOAH, naturally occurring affordable housing. And this is rental housing that is affordable to lower income renters. It's not subsidized by the government. This is housing that just tends to be older. It tends to be maybe lower quality in neighborhoods where housing prices are less. The thing though is, naturally occurring, is, perhaps a handy nickname, but what's really going on is that this is housing that is filtering down over time as properties age. And it's not necessarily going to happen automatically in markets where there is really tight supply, where the price of housing gets bid up. That sort of removes this, because it's not restricted, that can remove NOAH housing from the affordable supply. And because of that process, and also the obsolescence of some of housing in other markets, in the United States as a whole, over 16 years previous, there were 1.3 million NOAH units lost. Now, we did, as part of the Wake County Affordable Housing Strategy, we did a look at what this looks like in Wake County. There are 9,800 NOAH units in Wake County in 2017. For our purposes of what we're considering affordable, we define this as 50% AMI, which is a pretty strict criterion. That's really truly looking at low and sort of extremely low income households below that. So 9,800 units, predominantly located in areas that have higher than average poverty rates in the county. And in terms of what does this typical unit actually look like? It's a garden-style unit that was built 30 to 50 years ago. 80% of the units are garden-style, and the vast majority were built between 1970 and 1990. So ultimately, what does this all sort of add up to is a gap in the supply of affordable housing in the region. Every year, due to the potential of the sort of the loss of NOAH units, as well as concerns about expiring subsidies, there's projected to be a loss of 900 affordable units. And as we all know, this is one of the fastest growing regions in the country. Every year, the need for affordable housing units is going up, 3,000 to 3,700. So all told, that means we need to produce, if we just want to keep up with the current demand, we need to produce 4,000 to 4,600 units of affordable housing every year, whether that's subsidized, whether that's preserving naturally occurring affordable housing. So definitely significant challenges that we'll face, but I'm excited everyone's here today to talk about potential solutions. And for additional information, we're happy to speak about our work on affordable housing strategy. And now I'm going to turn things over to John Hodges-Koppel of Triangle J Council of Governments, who's going to take a further deep dive into the local market. John.
Thanks. So Kyle's really painted that picture, I think, pretty clearly. And it was really echoed by that first panel as well, in terms of how do we deal with this prospect of maybe having to address 4,000 units a year in and year out, as this region grows. Yeah, the most important thing that I'm presenting is that I am not Aspen Romine. So Aspen, unfortunately, is under the weather. So she has pulled together this presentation. I'll try to do it as much justice as I can. But she really is, as Bill noted, working on this day in and day out, has a lot of access to information, works a lot with our local communities on trying to get a deeper dive in their situations as we try to address these. To start with, let me remind you what Triangle J is and is not. So we're a 7-county regional planning agency. One of the nicest things is we don't tax you and we don't regulate you. So we're really the place where we try to get people around the table to identify issues like this and work cooperatively on solutions. And in fact, in years past, we've worked closely with ULI on this issue and others like land use and transit. So one of the things we've heard out at Triangle J is that this is an issue that is of growing concern, and not just for what you might think of as the usual suspects, the Raleighs, the Durhams, the Chapel Hills. This is the issue of housing affordability is resonating really across our 7 counties. I've been at Triangle J a long time, and I like to say there's always 3 big regional issues. There's water, there's transportation, and there's X. And X changes periodically. And right now, X is housing affordability. So we do work with Chatham County. We've done a lot of work around transit investments and how those can consider housing affordability. And one of the reasons that I think this has become an increasingly regional issue is because the housing market writ large has become more regional, because our job market has become more regional, and therefore our commuting market is increasingly regional. So we have, I think it's 28% of folks in these 7 counties that live in one county and work in another. So they're caring about what happens not just in their home county, but in the place they're going to for work. And of course, in a couple of our counties, Johnston and Chatham, fully half of the workers leave each day to go work in another county. So that housing market for an employer in Wake County may be a concern in Johnston or Chatham County. Kyle really already covered some of the product types, some of the issues. That missing middle piece, where you're not the 200-unit apartment complex, you're not the single-family attached or detached unit. That's the piece that can probably have some good affordability provisions if we can figure out a way to actually build those. The other trend, and I'm sure if anybody's sat through a demographics presentation, you've heard this, where looking forward, we're likely to have many more 1- and 2-person households, many more households that don't have children. And so looking at that mismatch between what our housing stock is now and what the households of the future might be is going to be a challenge, because of course one way you can save cost is to have smaller units. Coming out of the recession, we've been playing catch up. So for a while there, we continued to have good household formation in the Triangle, but we're not creating new units. And so we've been playing catch up. We've been doing a pretty good job. One of the questions, of course, moving forward is at what point we might be getting into that concern about oversupply overall, not on the affordability side, but overall. So currently in the 5 counties that we're specifically looking at here, we're about 1.7 million people. And we're expected to add another million over the next generation, roughly another 400,000 housing units needed to be supplied. Where will those units be? That's kind of the golden question. That's where you make all your money by figuring that out correctly. A lot of them are going to be in Wake County, a lot of them are going to be in Durham County, and a lot of them are going to be in Johnston County. So those are the places where this affordability crunch is probably going to be greatest. Because everybody likes a math quiz, Aspen has created one. So think about, of the residential units that we're building, that have received a building permit over the past 6 years, what proportion do you think are in sort of larger multifamily? And here, large isn't very large, it's 5+. But think of that rental multifamily market. So if you've got that in your mind. So the answer is at 31%. So roughly 30% of the new units permitted every year are on the multifamily side. In this chart, we actually have those 2 to 4 units, the duplexes, the triplexes, the fourplexes, but you can't see them because they are so tiny. So that missing middle challenge will continue to be a challenge. And the bottom line is there's rapid increase in housing values across the triangle. So this is not just a central Raleigh, not just a central Durham issue. Here, lighter colors are increased housing values, and we have them in central areas, but we also have them in outlying areas. And Kyle briefly mentioned, and I hear this when I talk with a lot of folks who work more in housing, is that there are two sides to the coin. It's not just an affordable housing supply issue, it's also an income challenge. So because our wages, especially on the lower end of the spectrum, have not kept pace with earnings growth on the higher end, we're kind of making that challenge even greater. Now, I think in the last couple months, there's some sense that there's movement in wages, whether that gets sustained or not. But that's part of the housing challenge. You can address it from providing more affordable units, but you can also do things to perhaps boost the wages and salaries of the folks that are in the market for housing. Kyle mentioned that definition of cost-burdened households. Housing cost-burdened households are those ones that spend 30% or more of their gross income on either mortgage or rent and utilities. And again, so the red places here are where 50% or more of the households living there are cost-burdened. They're not just concentrated in a few places. They are spread across our region. Another way to look at that is where in our region would the median rent that's actually charged today, where would it be affordable to different segments of the housing market? So in this case, the bluer colors are better. Those are places where a greater proportion of the housing market can afford that median rent. And this is a case where you tend to get those out on the outer edges. And that brings that whole challenge of the housing plus transportation costs. So yes, you may be able to afford housing, but then you've got a lot higher transportation costs. And that brings in the question of, do we have the transit systems to be able to serve those? Second and last math question for you. So what proportion of rental units in the 5 counties have a legally binding affordability restriction? So Kyle already talked about NOAA, right? Naturally occurring affordable housing. That's stuff that the market is providing and yet is affordable, largely because it's probably older, of lower quality. And then we have legally binding affordability restricted housing, LBAR. So that's the stuff that's public housing authority, or it's a low-income housing tax credit. I kind of picture NOAA and LBAR as this Old Testament couple that represents our housing choices. So what percent do you think is currently falling in one of those two categories? And the answer is 11%. Right now, NOAA units in the 5 counties make up about 41% of the multifamily market, so not the total market. But again, let me stress, we have Erica Brown here on our staff who also works in housing. Aspen works a lot as well, and I encourage you, especially if ULI is going to pursue this issue, and I hope we will, that you reach out to Aspen and to Erica. I think we can have a really great partnership between the public sector and the private sector, and I think the previous panel indicated that that's what it's going to take. That the private sector is not going to be able to do this by itself, You saw Kyle's funding chart. The public sector is not going to be able to invest enough to solve it by itself. And so if we're actually going to do something meaningful, it's going to be because we work together and get creative and do not one or two things, but probably 7 or 8 things. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Bill.
All right, well, thank you so much. That was a lot of really great data, and I think you're starting to get a sense of what we're dealing with regionally. But I wanted to sort of take it into, why does it matter? Why do we need to care about this? If you're not in housing, how does this affect you? And I think that you'll see that there's a lot of things that this has an effect on in our region. Remember that map that John just showed us, where we have 26% of our region already living in counties that they don't work in. That's going to continue to be exacerbated as the housing supply spreads out. My wife currently works in Durham, and we live here in downtown Raleigh. You're going to see more and more of that as the housing market spreads out. And you can see that happening. These are headlines just in the last few months, with development going to south of Fuquay Varina, our fastest growing suburb in Apex. And suburban development's a good thing. There's a lot of great things that come from that. They're great communities. It's wonderful to add housing in those places, but that's not necessarily where all the jobs are, right? And so as we add more jobs here in the core, remember you heard in that first panel that we have companies looking more and more at the urban core to attract talent. Then we have a mismatch, right, where we are able to add housing that's more affordable, it's further out. And so what you end up with is a lot of congestion and longer commuting times. And as we track it through the census, we see that our commuting times are slowly increasing. And those of you all who drive on I-40 or some of our other big corridors have already probably felt that just in the past few years. There's also a lot of connections between public health and educational attainment with our housing market. When we have longer commute times, we have less time for physical activity. We've seen that there are exposure to toxins from substandard and older housing has led to more asthma and other breathing problems for those residents. We have an opportunity for more green building when we have new housing, which can reduce energy costs, can make it more affordable to stay in that housing. Housing security can really reduce stress and improve mental health and educational attainment. When I was in college, I used to do reading tutoring in a neighborhood in Athens, Georgia, and one of my tutors kept moving every month. They had to move every single month. It was incredibly disruptive to his life. He wasn't able to concentrate on homework. He never knew who his neighbors were. His mom was always having to work to make sure that they could make the rent. And part of what he needed were eyeglasses, but they couldn't afford them because they kept trying to just survive in the housing that they could find. So there's an enormous amount of stress that comes from housing insecurity. Lower housing costs mean that you're able to spend more on other needs, right? So you're able to spend more on food, you're able to spend more on activities. So children grow up healthier, couples remain healthier because you have more money when you're not having to spend it all on housing. And we have better neighborhoods mean more walking and access to amenities. So when we have these dense, stronger neighborhoods, that means you have the opportunity to walk more and be healthier. And there's those neighborhood effects. We talk a lot about gentrification, which is a two-sided coin, right? It's good to see neighborhoods improve. It's good to see neighborhoods become safer, to have more people. But the challenge is displacement, right? That's the issue with gentrification, is that ultimately if we displace people, those people still need somewhere to live, but it's going to be further away. It's going to be in lesser housing. And so then when we concentrate poverty in these further away places, not only are we asking them to spend more money on their commuting, but we're also isolating them and giving them less economic mobility. And homogeneous communities, whether they're rich or poor, are just simply less dynamic. The best neighborhoods in the country, the places that are most attractive for jobs, are those places which are diverse, which have a lot of different people and a range of opportunity inside of them. Finally, more housing can slow rental growth in these neighborhoods. So in some ways, the more we're able to add housing, we can slow that rate of displacement. I'll give you an example from here in downtown Raleigh, because that's really what I spend most of my time thinking about. So if you look at this chart, you have 4 bars here. Each of them represents a year. Every single March at Downtown Raleigh Alliance, we do a census of all of our housing in downtown. So the far left bar is 2015. We did that in March of 2015. Then the next one is 2016. 2017, and 2018. What you notice, what the little arrows are pointing to, is that from 2016, March of 2016 into March of 2017, rent in downtown Raleigh actually went down briefly. And the reason it went down is because in a 20-month period, we added over 1,800 units, which is an enormous amount of supply. So you saw that when we added that supply, we actually were able to slow rental growth. Of course, look what happened in March of 2018. Rent had gone back up 9%. That shows you how fast our demand is moving in this region. Now, this is in the center city, but that shows you how quickly demand is moving in this region, is that we added 1,800 units, it slowed rent for a few months, and then it started ticking back up. So it shows you the power of our attraction and the power of our growth in this region. Finally, economic development. Economic development and housing are intricately related. Cost of living is a powerful attraction for our employers. Housing availability matters to employers. It's something that they look at. We spend a lot of time working with our partners at the city and the chamber, talking to companies looking at this region, and housing availability is incredibly important to them. And you can see that it has started to change the narrative around economic development when we have a housing crisis. You have across the country strong reactions to Amazon's HQ2, and it's all rooted in we're not sure our housing market can take it. So we're starting to have reactions where we don't want jobs coming to our regions across the country because we're concerned that our housing market can't handle it. That's very problematic. And it's very problematic because growth will continue. The things that attracted Amazon to put us on a short list, or Apple, or all these other major employers, are not things that are going to go away. And they were not things that were unique to those companies. We didn't have anything that only Amazon wanted that no other company wants. It's the same formula for all these employers. We have 3 Tier 1 research universities. There's only a handful of metros in the country that have that. Every week we're on a new list for top places to live, top places to do business. And the growth will continue. This is a projection from the city of Raleigh of the city's growth over the next few years. We currently have 465,000 people inside the city of Raleigh. We're going to have 600,000 people in 15 years. That's an enormous amount of growth for the city to take on. So the growth won't end because those factors, that talent base, our cost of living, our quality of life, those things are attractive to any employer, and they're going to continue. So what we need to make sure of is that our future doesn't look like this. Our path forward isn't gridlocked and homogeneous and holding us back, but instead that our future is a place where all of us are moving forward, where we're able to move forward in a variety of types of housing, different types of lifestyles, and do so together side by side, and make sure that this is a region where all of us are moving forward and all of us are welcome. And that's our task. So thank you all so much. We're going to take a few questions. I'm going to invite our panelists back up. What are some of the strategies you're seeing in other parts of the country for increasing housing supply?
Thanks, Bill. I would break this question down into both sort of producing overall housing supply and also producing affordable housing. Because as I talked about with Noah, in terms of producing overall housing supply, and as you just demonstrated in downtown Raleigh, when you can add to that supply, that sort of provides really an opportunity to capture more residents such that they're not bidding up the price of existing older housing. For instance, we worked and led the production of the City of Boston's recent comprehensive plan. It was their first comprehensive plan in 50 years. It was underpinned by a large degree towards preventing the city from becoming even more unaffordable than it is today. And the city set a housing target of creating over 50,000 housing units. And a lot of, sort of turning their full policy apparatus, all of their tools, zoning, really towards trying to produce trying to produce housing in general. It was viewed as a pressure release valve for accommodating that demand without it pushing up the price of existing housing. And they designated specific areas in the city and neighborhoods where they wanted to see housing growth. And they have seen, much like you saw in downtown Raleigh, a mitigation in some of those price increases. In terms of actually producing regulated affordable housing, that's a trickier proposition, and certainly the rules differ from state to state. North Carolina is a state where you tend to have fewer tools than some of the other markets we work in. But one thing that we have seen success with is sort of an inclusionary policy, which would be incorporating a certain percentage of often workforce housing units into a market rate development. As a matter of policy, can be as part of a bonus. So for instance, Right now, we're helping the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, across the river from Boston, sort of update their inclusionary zoning policy. Right now, you basically get a 30% density bonus in exchange for needing to do 20% of your units as affordable. And we're helping them sort of think about and recalibrate that to make it more attractive and try to produce more housing. So I think solutions like that try to work with the market and offer perhaps a carrot in terms of a density bonus can be the sorts of things that can find a win-win solution.
Great, wonderful. John, one of the things that our region has done that's really exciting is that we have passed transit plans. So Wake Transit Plan was passed, and we've got a source of funding for that. We're moving forward on that. Durham and Orange counties have also moved forward on their light rail system. What is the opportunity that these transportation projects have in terms of our housing market?
All right. So a couple things. One that I think is especially interesting is if you have that really high quality transit that can serve all day, very frequent, then your reach to get to housing becomes a lot easier. So whereas right now you've got that intense competition in the hearts of downtowns, or in particular, I like the term best business districts, so think North Hills. To the degree you can extend that reach of what a household sees as value in being proximate to jobs or university or entertainment, that's what transit can give you done right. And I know we've done a lot of work primarily with Go Triangle along the Durham-Orange light rail line that's planned. And looking at those opportunities for taking product that probably wants to be more in a downtown, but that could be in some of these other locations. I think the other thing that transit can do, which can be real important, is to the degree we already have publicly owned land, and I would argue partner-owned land, if you've got an institution that has similar interests, and universities can certainly be one of them, is having that asset to work with is such a huge foundation for being able to be successful, and then making kind of smart decisions about how to use those assets that are already in public or anchor institutional ownership, and then can then be served by transit to get people to jobs, to shopping, to medical appointments. So I'm real eager to see how we do. There is, of course, there's a time frame between when that lands and the actions we need to take to kind of secure some housing opportunities along there.
Great, yeah, that's a good point. I want to open it up to questions. I have plenty more, but I'd like to open up to questions. I think we have microphone runners. We have a question right here in the front. So if we can get a microphone up here, that would be great.
Does that work? So start off with what a terrific presentation. This is first rate. To lay out the data the way you've done is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, it's not.
I think you just got to really lay into it, John. Just get that inner New York and just get in there. All right? Yeah.
How's that?
Louder.
No. How's that?
That's
Oh,
it.
good.
There it is.
There we go. There we go. Thank you. It's a terrific presentation. Question, I'm not sure exactly how to frame it. Kyle, you were talking about Boston. I think about San Francisco and I think about New York. New York has opened up its supply, starting with the west side, but now on Park Avenue. And that supply has dramatically reduced the rents. Not only for Class A, but Class B and Class C properties across the city. San Francisco has taken sort of a different approach. They have constrained the supply, and the affordability has gone totally off the charts in San Francisco. So in thinking about when you had the intersecting lines, I'm thinking that the opposite is happening even in the triangle, where there's a constraining of supply, whether it's because construction costs have gone up or it's because it takes longer to get a property built. And in the interim, because the demand remains strong, prices go up there's a waterfall down to the bottom rung, and there's only limited supply of subsidies for housing, and those at the bottom end becomes more impacted than the top end because we're constraining the supply at the top. So have any of you, John, you include yourself in this, what are our thoughts relative to correlating constraining the supply at the top, impacting the costs at the bottom where we're least able to deal with it relative to subsidies?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can go first. I mean, I think certainly, and I think there's a lot of just literature in economics that has pretty well demonstrated that markets that have constrained supply historically, like San Francisco, you compare their long-term trend versus a market, say, like Houston that has not, there's high demand to live in both places, but when you constrain supply, that demand manifests itself as higher prices instead of just more people living in the area and more growth. So certainly, in Raleigh and Wake County and really the whole triangle, we're starting to see those pressures on NOAA. Right now we're working on the Capitol Boulevard North Corridor study. A lot of sort of naturally occurring affordable housing in the city is located along that corridor. At our community meeting we had 2 weeks ago, I just kept hearing over and over again from homeowners and renters in that area, their number one concern was sort of displacement, that even traditionally affordable neighborhoods, they were seeing prices that they couldn't even imagine a couple of years ago. And to your point, one way to sort of constrain and limit the pace of that change is if you have more sort of supply at the top, such that you can maintain and keep that sort of filtering process going on. Because like I mentioned, it's only natural occurring if there's a constant sort of supply and demand that's working. And if that's not working and housing doesn't become more affordable over time, then you get real significant problems. You need to rely on subsidies more that are getting smaller, and the whole thing starts to fall apart.
Yeah, I think another piece of it, and it's, any of these discussions, I think it's real important to be thinking about those different market segments. So are you talking, 30%, 50%? So you heard the earlier panel talking about what was driving up costs, and what were the most things they were talking about? Labor, materials, nothing there having to do with something that government is going to be able to control. And so, for some of this market, for whether it's 30%, whether it's 50%, you just can't build a unit, even if there were no regulation on limiting supply, to serve that. For some of the higher upper end, you probably could. The other piece is what you're then trading off. So if you're building that urban product, right, you're also building the 30,000 per garaged parking space. If you can do some of these things in the best business districts, so a little further out, and you can surface park them, you can affect your costs there. Filtering in our region, I think, is going to be a lot harder, and correct me if I'm wrong, partly because we're a smaller region with very rapid growth. So the stuff that's available to filter, that stuff that was built before, is a smaller percentage of the overall market moving forward. So if 1 million people in the New York region, whatever. 1 million here, that's big. And so I think we're going to be challenged to even have, filtering will help to some degree, but we're starting from a smaller base. So I think that's another piece of it. The market segment and just the base from which we've got stuff that people can move into.
Other questions? All right, we have a question right here. It's in the middle here, yep.
You talked a little bit about the missing middle. I'm wondering how you can make those smaller scale apartments possible to build, especially from a public sector. We have a land in a residential neighborhood. And should it be rental or owner occupied?
So I'll take a first shot, and I am by no means an expert on missing middle. I do think from what I've heard is that there's a range of product choices there, and so missing middle can include everything from an accessory dwelling unit. I live in Durham; those things seem to be fairly easy to do. Raleigh, apparently not so much, but that's one end. There's townhouse product, which I think was, in my view, sort of underbuilt for a while. I think it's now becoming more possible. But who builds duplexes and triplexes and quads anymore? I don't know if there's folks out there that are doing that product type, and I'm no real estate guy. But that'd be interesting to know. Are there those smaller opportunities to do that kind of product? And I assume the financials on it are not attractive, and that's why that stuff's not getting built. But my view is it's a range of things, that there's not one sweet spot to it. The only thing I'd add is, and I am spacing out on their name, but if you talk to me afterwards, I've seen a really good presentation done where sometimes on the missing middle side, it seems like we get too wrapped up on the density and not wrapped up enough on the design. So if you go talk to folks in neighborhoods, you can probably walk them by a 2 to 3 story older apartment building that might be at 30, 40 units per acre, and they're real comfortable with that. Because it's kind of human scale, it's probably not overparked. But if you go to a neighborhood and say, gosh, we really need to have 30 to 40 units per acre in your neighborhood, I mean, it just blows up. So I don't think we've been able to convey what a missing middle product can look like and feel like in a neighborhood context in a way that people can feel comfortable with it.
Yeah, John, and I would just add, so there's definitely a regulatory component to it and a zoning component. Is it allowed? And then I think it's also a matter of, to the point of sort of, is there a market for it? I would also just, put part of it on sort of the lending process, and in terms of getting financing, people get very comfortable, lending towards these conventional products, like it's a mid-rise stick-built building, 200 units. That's what they're comfortable with. It's their bread and butter. And there might be sort of less creativity and comfort in trying to do some of the more interesting product types, that could help fill in some of these gaps. But as as those lots dwindle in terms of what can accommodate a true sort of mid-rise building, we're going to have to get more creative as a whole. And I think that includes the lending community too.
Absolutely. Other questions? We have one in the back there.
I have a question about some of the policies that have been put into place, both in Raleigh and in Durham, that seem to take massive swaths of land off the table for essentially forever by sort of these neighborhood conservation overlay districts or large historic districts that essentially limit, density by means of wider lot requirements that, for example, in the North Hills neighborhood, took maybe 170 acres and dropped that to like a 6 to the acre zoning essentially forever, because changing these things is nearly impossible. Are you seeing a trend in many cities where residents are so concerned about change that this reaction occurs where a legacy district gets created? And how are those cities, attempting to responsibly protect the character of a neighborhood while at the same time preserve some flexibility for future generations to have the ability to add density in smart ways?
And was that more a question about what other places or other regions have done?
Other regions, and how would you advise our city to think of things like that?
Do you have any thought on, have you seen what other regions have done?
Not exactly in regard to historic districts. I would say that, it certainly needs to be a careful community conversation. Raleigh, the Triangle has relative, historic housing makes up a much smaller percentage of the city and in the region in general than it does in many other areas. So I think it's, a special concern here of how those districts are treated in the Triangle.
The other thing, I always like to roll at least one grenade when I'm on a panel. So I do think it's worth looking at what is the evidence that, so talk about 170 acres. What's the evidence that doing anything on 170 acres in the region would be meaningful in terms of housing affordability over the long haul? Maybe it is. I don't have the evidence on it. I do think, and it would apply to all of us, people care about the neighborhood within which they live. They see that as the house is often the largest asset somebody has. There is a lot of education that can be done around issues that are probably more myth than fact, that affordable housing will lead to crime, or and at Triangle J we've tried to do very short information pieces on what does the evidence really show. But I would argue it's a two-way street. So local governments have been severely constrained in what they can do design-wise by the legislature, right? And the legislature doesn't come up with those ideas by themselves, right? They come from folks who are probably in the development community. One of the ways communities historically have been able to get neighborhoods to feel more comfortable about density or change is to be able to guarantee design aspects of it. So we're all responsible for the way things go. And I think it's only through kind of true partnership that we're going to get some solutions going. But my guess is that solution is going to come from both some compromise on the private sector side and some increased investment on the public sector side. And I think thinking it won't happen through that mechanism, I'm a little doubtful. I'd certainly want to hear how it could. But I think if we want to make meaningful change to address these issues, we're all going to have to get out of our comfort zone a little bit. So that's my grenade for the day.
All right. Other questions? We have one in the middle here. John's throwing bombs up here.
That's because I don't regulate in tax.
That's right.
So this question is more towards labeling of it. So while affordable housing has been a hot topic and there's lots of positive talks about it, the need for it, in terms of the general population, if you're to say, hey, I'm doing an affordable project, 20% affordable, that doesn't necessarily have a positive. There's a lot of negative stigma with it. Have you guys seen anything different as far as labeling? We've heard workforce housing. Is there a different way to package it or position it with the community if you're to do a project like that?
Yeah, so and we've put out a couple publications where we'll take that same chart that Kyle showed, and we'll plug in a picture of that school teacher and that nurse and that police officer. They're the ones making that. We'll plug in the picture of your grandmother who may need to be in the public housing. But you're right, the term is people are going to think Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis or something. So it's a continual challenge to put a face to what we're talking about, to show examples. I think there's some case studies maybe later on, show some examples of what this thing is and how it doesn't have to be threatening. But because it's prospective, you can never quite guarantee some things. So I don't think there's any magic solution to that other than kind of continual, honest, transparent information about it. Here's who lives in these types of units. I think we've done that in one of our communities where there was some pushback on a LIHTC project because they were associating it with a housing authority product. And those are very different clients just based on the way the income works. So I wish there were magic there. I think it's just kind of continual education, information, and that takes work. You probably have, hopefully, some simpler, more optimistic
I think that's
view
where
on
the
it.
term workforce housing basically came from.
Yeah.
To address some of those, some of those concerns and just its messaging. But I mean, certainly, even I showed the workforce housing, 60% above.
Yeah.
But really, I mean, the true deepest needs are for people below 60% AMI.
Yeah.
Many whom, vast majority of whom are also working.
Right.
And that's a real problem, and it's not going to go away, even if we don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, we should probably have a committee of branding people that come up with a solution there.
That's right. Other questions? We have one right here.
I'll just yell. I haven't heard anybody talking about the role of land trust in this whole issue. Could you speak to that and how that may have worked in other communities and what we might be able to do here to initiate those types of land purchases that then turn to affordable housing?
Sure. So the essential model of a land trust is to really sort of try to lock in affordability by purchasing land, and so owners can sort of experience a modest amount of appreciation over time, but really try to sort of lock in that affordability. They can be very complicated to set up, but it's certainly something that's really worth exploring. Some of the communities we've worked with have gone in different directions in terms of trying to support the land trust. They can work in particular market contexts, sometimes better than others. But they're, I think, certainly very much the type of creative policy solution that the Triangle and the cities in the Triangle really need to be looking at exploring further.
And we have some great examples where, and I hope, you've got a panel later on that if at all possible, you need to stick around for, because they're the folks that are down in the weeds doing this stuff. And, so Patrick Young, who's here from Durham, can tell you about the Durham Community Land Trustees. The neighborhood that they've been working in for years would be very different but for their efforts. I mean, it's now a place that is hot and would be gentrifying, but they own a significant amount of land there that has been able to keep it more affordable than it would otherwise be. So, and to your point, I think we're just wrapping up a look at housing affordability along the planned Durham Orange light rail lines. The first one we're kind of looking at, we'll be looking at Wake's BRT and bus lines as well. And I want to say there's probably 24 different strategies, land trust being one of them. But I do think it's going to take a whole lot of different things that are related to different segments of that market in different locations to be meaningful. And certainly land trust is both something we've got here in North Carolina, has a track record of success, and is going to be probably a part of that solution. And a long-term one takes time to do that.
Right. Other questions? We have one right here in the middle.
Can you just share with us what one or two comparable cities, let's say in terms of our population, are doing right in the country, that would be, in your mind, sort of something that we could look at as a go-by?
Well, I don't know if, certainly I'd say one thing that a lot of fast-growing cities, are top comps, you would compare them, Nashville, Austin, et cetera. They're really pursuing strategies to just build more housing. And in some of these cities, it's just not keeping up with pace, such that you're starting to see prices significantly rise, first in Austin, then Nashville. A lot of people would say Raleigh-Durham is next in terms of those price points getting pushed up. So, a lot of the cities of our size and that ilk have historically done that well, but now they're finding they need to move towards other solutions as well. One thing that Austin did was implement a downtown density bonus program. That, the primary way you get more density downtown above the existing zoning is by providing affordable housing. Our firm helped design that program. Other things they do, sort of at a larger scale, try to bring more funding resources. You see some of these mid-sized cities around the country, depending on what their financial resources are, they do affordable housing bonds to specifically bring more housing dollars to the problem. So, those are two things we're seeing.
Yeah, and Chapel Hill, for example, just passed a $10 million housing bond on Tuesday. So I think, I'm impressed with sort of three foundations we have, and then the question is to what degree we successfully leverage these foundations. So the first is, one of the beauties of where I sit is I get to talk with a lot of elected officials in a lot of different kinds of communities. And this is an issue where across the board they care, they legitimately care, it's not just talk, and they want to be part of the solution. So often, you talk about political will, that, so we've got the foundation for political will. I'm convinced of that. So that's one. Number two, you can't swing a 2x4 and not hit a university expert in our region. So we've got these tier 1 universities. We've got smart people that know about financing. So how do we leverage that expertise across the region to do it? So I think that's the second thing. And then the third is I do think we've got some creative opportunities around publicly owned land, anchor institutions, not for their university expertise, but for their land holdings and their inroads to their employment, who they employ. And there's great examples. Both Duke and UNC have contributed to affordable housing projects in their communities. I think there's more opportunity there. I think there's opportunity with our medical centers. Bill was talking about that connection between health and housing, between stability. So I think there's, but if we don't get creative, right? If we don't do something different than all these other places have done, I think we'll be back here 10 years saying, gosh, could have done more. I mean, Arlington, Virginia tries to do things right? Transit, they've done stuff right. They care about housing. I think their naturally occurring affordable housing, I think, dropped by like 70, 80% over the last 10 years or something like that. It will disappear in a fast-growing, attractive place if we don't get creative and leverage our assets. I think that's the bottom line.
I want to thank our panel. This has been a really great discussion. I think we've had really, really great data, so please thank them. And I'm going to invite TJ back on stage to give us an overview of the next steps.
All right. Well, thank you very much to the panel. I think it was very informative. They pulled together a bunch of information. And I think you could feel it in the room in terms of people's buy-in into it, but also the difficulty of the questions and the difficulty of the solutions to the questions are there are so many different incentives. And, I think about it from the private side, and the natural reaction from a development person like myself would be, but let's not have any restrictions to supply, let's only incentivize supply, and that'll probably fix everything and just filter down, and that'll work. And to some of John's points and some of the other ones, that's probably not going to solve the problem on its own. Then you have landowners in the middle where they have a exact financial incentive. Once I own a house, I want my neighborhood to increase in value, but that makes it by definition less affordable for other people that are buying their first house or moving up and that type of thing. So there's that financial disincentive, and I think then you see that played out in the public sector because people get elected to county commissions and city councils all over the region and all over the nation with people saying two things. One, save my neighborhood, don't change anything about our city, and then two, we want growth because I want more jobs and I want housing to stay affordable. And those are contrary. So it's just interesting to see as you piece through this that nobody's in the clear. Nobody you can't answer it in a way that completely helps one person and completely hurts another. There's just everybody's tied in together. And that's kind of the cool side, is that as you get everybody talking about it, you see, gosh, there probably do need to be 7, 8 solutions that kind of get paired together and everybody gives here. And the more clear it is, everybody understands why we're doing it. Because as a homeowner, I don't want everybody to lose. I do want my house to go up in value, but maybe there is some middle ground. So as we start talking about middle grounds, that's the exciting part. And that's what we saw in that group of 10 to 20, 30 people that were getting together. And it's exciting to see the same thing in a larger group. So appreciate that. Appreciate the questions and the panelists. Also, the questions kind of started being perfect segues into what we're hitting the rest of the day. So the next panel, so we're going to break for lunch now. We've got also a lot of, let's get a round of applause for Olivia Martin. She has organized a ton of stuff today. And she's got a certain cocktail of caffeine and sandwiches and hopefully some fruit and other sides out there that everybody can grab a box lunch. We're going to take about 30, 35 minutes to hang out there, network, have lunch. You can eat here at the tables, kind of the intent of the round tables. Continue the discussion that's just started now. And then as we come back, we're going to get that national perspective. What are other comparable, larger, what are cities with bigger problems or smaller problems or faster growth than Raleigh? How are they grappling with land use and what are the impacts of that? And Mac's going to hit a lot of that with Tom, and that'll be the next panel. And then we'll kind of come back local to talk about the financial impacts and what is happening out there in the market, trajectory of rents and costs and things like that. More economic side, but deal specific. And then again, finish with local case studies of what are people doing to move and shake and create affordable housing. So anyway, thank you very much. Thanks for sticking around and hope you enjoy lunch.